back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I'm doing the book recommendations tag. I had plans to give you a vlog today, but it just didn't happen. I have vlog clips recorded, but I haven't wrapped any of them up or finished editing any of them. So we're doing a tag today, and I hope that's okay with you. October just like really got away with me in terms of busyness, and then some sickness and health flares and things happening too in conjunction with all the busyness. So it's been a wild ride. I saw Victoria from A Musical Bookworm do this tag recently, and I hadn't seen it before. I thought it was really interesting, so decided I would dive in. This is an opportunity to talk about some of my favorite books, and hopefully you'll get some new recommendations. Question number one is, what is a book you tell people is your favorite? And that would have to be Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I love this book so much. There's not a single word I would change in it. I love it to pieces, and I actually just completed in September my third time reading this book, and it's still not old. I still just love it. I think it's so masterfully done in exploring the psychology of like human nature and different viewpoints and different philosophical thought points that were happening in Russia at the time that still feel relevant today. It's probably my favorite of all time, although it's really hard to say that. Like, as a bookworm, as someone who reads a lot, it's difficult to say what is actually your favorite of all time, but when people ask me, this is often the first book that comes to mind. Question number two is a book that is your guilty pleasure. And I don't have a really good answer for this, honestly, just because I don't have any books that I'm like, okay, I shouldn't love this, but I do, or like that I'm embarrassed to admit that I like. I don't have anything like that. So the thing that came to mind is something that feels maybe a bit more guilty pleasure-ish, is that I have really been enjoying Japanese cozy fiction lately. And I say guilty pleasure only because it feels like it doesn't necessarily like contribute anything meaningful to my life, and it also doesn't feel like really fast-paced or like super like interesting maybe to a lot of people, but it just feels like a hug in a book, and I've really been enjoying that. And one of my favorites that I have read this year is the Kamigawa Food Detectives. This is a story that is so foodie, and if you love food, especially Japanese food, I think you'll love it. It's about a detective who stops being a detective and ends up opening a restaurant, and people come to him with these dishes that they've eaten in their lives that they can't find anymore, whether it's because the restaurant has closed or maybe a person who has passed away made it for them in their childhood or something like that. And he does research and then gives them the food, and we find out why that food like meant so much to that person. And it's just so cozy and so foodie. It's very light on the mystery and detective side, as we don't see his process for how he figures out how it's the right taste or flavor or anything like that. We kind of just skip over that and only see his interactions with the client who's coming to him, but that didn't matter to me. I still really loved it. Question number three is a book everyone loved but you didn't. Oh man, I feel like I have some really unpopular opinions on new releases. So I'm gonna share two here. One that I feel like I haven't heard anyone else say anything bad about, and then the other one is one that I read this year. So you can hear one that's more recent and one that's from like a couple of years ago. So the book that was more recent is When the Day Comes by Gabrielle Meyer, and I read this book earlier this year, I think in February, for my in-person book club. And this is a Christian historical fiction, and it's a dual timeline. So the main character is a time traveler, and when she falls asleep in one time period, she'll wake up in the other one, back and forth and back and forth. When she reaches a certain age, she is forced to make a decision of which timeline she's going to stay in. And I didn't enjoy it. I tried really hard to like it, because when people found out I was reading it, a whole bunch of people told me this is my favorite book of the year last year. I loved it so much. And so I tried to keep an open mind. But if I'm being honest, I just didn't think that it was very good in a lot of ways. I'm not going to get into all the ways right now, but I will say that I felt like the prose was better than I expected, and that it wasn't like the worst. It just really isn't my kind of genre. I really don't like historical romance in general, and didn't really buy into the romance at all. And there were logistics with the time travel stuff that I was just like, didn't make sense to me. And some of the spiritual stuff I didn't really like either. There were issues that I have with it. I'll just say that. Another one that I've never heard anyone say anything bad about is Remarkably Bright Creatures. This is a story that has like multiple viewpoints, and one of the viewpoints is an octopus at an aquarium, and one is an older lady who is working at the aquarium as a janitor in the evenings, and like the connection that the two of them have. And I liked some of the old lady's point of view, though I felt like it was really standoffish. I thought that the octopus's parts were like the best part of the book, but we have another viewpoint that was not even mentioned in the back of the book or anything like that. And that character is so annoying, and I didn't feel like he showed any growth, and he like really honestly made the book tank really hard for me. I think it would have been a middling book for me if it hadn't been for him, but because of him, I almost hated the book. I think I gave it like 2 stars. Let's move on to something a bit more positive. Question number 4, a book you read the fastest. I don't know if this is like the fastest, but I tell this story all the time of the very first time I read a Daphne du Maurier book was Rebecca. And I picked it up and started reading it at bedtime, as one does. And at this point, my husband was working for the post office, and he would get up super early in the morning. And he woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and he was like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm almost done." I just gotta know what happens. Needless to say, I really love Rebecca, and my first experience reading it was so positive, and I just went on to read a whole bunch more du Maurier after I finished Rebecca. Question number 5, a book that you think deserves more hype. And for that, I'm going to say a middle grade book that I read earlier this year, which is called My Diary from the Edge of the World. I've never heard anyone talk about this book except my friend Whitney, who I borrowed it from, and it was one of her daughter's favorite middle grades, and so Whitney read it and said she really enjoyed it. I borrowed it from Whitney. This book is so good. It's written in journal format about this girl, and she lives in this world that has like elements of the real world. So they still have like, 7-Elevens and Taco Bells, and they live in the United States, but there's also all these other magical creatures and things happening too. So there's some like alternate history that's happening there, like where they talk about the Civil War only lasting like a month or something like that, because the Sasquatches come out of the hills because they hate war, and they just like help one side win because they just want it to be over. And so like there's some alternate history like happening with these magical creatures, and there's this cloud that comes and will take people when it is time for them to die. And there's been a cloud that has been hovering over this girl's house, and her little brother is really sick. So they decide what they're going to do is they're going to go on this road trip in their RV and try to find the edge of the world, which then dumps into an alternate world where the cloud won't be able to reach her brother. It is so good. I feel like sometimes when you're reading journal books, it reads like just like a regular book, but I feel like the narration was so distinctive, and it felt really like a journal with this character's personality just bleeding onto the pages. It was so good. There were moments where it was really funny, moments where it was really heartwarming, and I just really liked the world building. Question number 6, a book that is becoming a movie or a TV show. I don't know. I really don't watch very many movies or very many TV shows, so I don't know what's getting an adaptation soon. I know that I just watched the Wild Robot movie with some friends in theaters, so I mean, I guess that's one that's already become a movie. So I don't know. I don't really keep track of like new things that are coming out very often, so I don't have a good answer. Question number 7, a book you have reread the most. That has to be the Lord of the Rings trilogy by J.R.R. Tolkien. I just finished a read through of Lord of the Rings this year, actually, with my Patreon, and that was so wonderful. And it was my 13th time reading the Lord of the Rings. And I used to read it every year annually from when I was 12 years old right up until I had my daughter. And then I hadn't read it since she was born. So there was a nice big gap in there, but there were 12 years consecutively that I read this book, the 3 books annually, and now I've read them 13 times. Question number 8, a book from a genre you don't typically read. So I have kind of like a really iffy relationship with YA books in general, especially because a lot of times just like the romance in YA books just feels like so over the top and cheesy to me. But a book that I really, really loved that was YA is The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea by Axio. I just thought that this was amazing. Maybe it's because there's a Korean element because it has like Korean mythology interwoven in this fantasy world, and it's just like really, really beautiful. So essentially the story is that there's this village that has to offer up the most beautiful girl from their village to the sea every year, to like the sea god, in hopes that like it will, I can't remember all the details, but I think in hopes that it will like appease him because they're experiencing storms and stuff. And the girl that's chosen, that's the most beautiful, is the main character's brother's fiance, and she can't bear the thought of her brother having to grieve in this way, so she offers herself instead as the sacrifice that year. And so she ends up beneath the sea in this kingdom and all of that kind of stuff. And oh my gosh, I just thought it was so well done. And it was the first YA I'd read in a while that I was like, I love this. Question number 9 is a book that deserves all the hype it gets. So instead of just a book, I'm actually going to give you an author, and that's Susanna Clarke. Anyone who has ever hyped Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell to you, or Piranesi, listen to them, because the hype is real. It's so good. Those books could not be more different in every way, shape, and form, honestly. Piranesi is like journal entries from this man that is like in this house and like doesn't know his name, and all this, something's going on and you don't even know what's going on. And Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is about these two magicians in England who are trying to resurrect magic in England, and it takes place during the Napoleonic Wars, and it is long and it is sprawling and it is very Dickensian feeling, and so they could not feel more different. But both of them are amazing in their own rights and what they are trying to do. I do like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell just a little bit better, I think. I read that one last year and Piranesi this year, but I love them both. Question number 10, a book you usually recommend when asked to give a recommendation. And I don't know, because usually it's like more specific, like someone wants a recommendation, like where do I start with a certain author? Where do I start with the classics or fantasy, or just, I don't know, like I don't usually just have someone say, hey, I need a book recommendation, and it's that broad. Usually it's a little bit more specific. I have a couple of videos of like where to start with certain authors. So I think I have one for Dostoevsky and one for Dickens. I will link both of those so that way, you know, there's some good recommendations that I commonly give for those authors. I also usually, when it comes to classics, recommend like Anne of Green Gables or Little Women or Jane Eyre as beginnings for classic literature, because they're all super easy to read and they're all wonderful, and most, if not all of them, have like long lasting like impacts in pop culture where people have heard of these, even if they haven't read them, they've bled into other works, or they have their own very famous adaptations. And then I will say, when it comes to fantasy, I do always recommend Brandon Sanderson, because Sanderson is the author that got me into epic high fantasy with hard magic systems. I was really intimidated by that until I read Sanderson. He made it really accessible to me and made me really, really love fantasy as an adult. Question number 11 is a book that has your favorite characters. So I really am probably going to sound slightly redundant here, but honestly, like Lord of the Rings probably has some of my favorite characters of all time. I mean, Sam is one of my favorite characters, but when you read the books, like Frodo is an amazing character, Aragorn is an amazing character. So I don't know, like I think I'm gonna say Lord of the Rings, because there's no other book that comes to mind with like characters that I like wholeheartedly adore and root for. Question number 12 is a book you wish you could live in. I would have said Lord of the Rings, but 3 times giving that answer is just too much. So instead, I'm going to say All Creatures Great and Small by James Herriot. I love these books. This series is like my ultimate comfort series. There's something so cozy and wonderful about these books. It's about a vet, a Scottish vet, who is living in England and practicing as a vet for farmers. I will say that if you don't enjoy veterinary type stuff, it does get kind of technical, very technical into some of the veterinary stuff and surgeries and procedures that are happening. So if that kind of stuff grosses you out, might not be your kind of place to park yourself. But the reason why I would want to live here is because it's set in like a fictional town, but like the description of the English countryside is so beautiful that I would 100% want to live there. Question number 13, a book you thought you would hate, but you ended up loving. That's gotta be The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. This is an adult fantasy that kind of has like some some Oliver Twist vibes to it a little bit, I guess. It's very heisty and about, you know, a young boy who's like an orphan being raised to be a thief. And there's a lot of thieving and drama that takes place in this book. I'd heard a lot of things about the content in this book, so I just wasn't really sure that it was gonna be a book for me because I was warned that it had a lot of strong language in it, and it does, and it has some kind of like gritty violence in it, and it does. But I ended up at my library and this book was being removed from the shelves and it was only 25 cents, and I was like, well, you know what, for a quarter, like, I want to see if I like this book, but my library is about to not have it anymore for me to give it a try. So I bought it for 25 cents and I actually really, really liked it. And I've been meaning to go on in the series, although the series is not complete. I think there's one more book that needs to come out, but the first 3 books are out. And I bought book 2 and I still haven't read it, but at this point I probably need to reread book 1 to understand what's going on in book 2. Question number 14, a book that made you cry. Okay, so a book that probably made me cry harder than any book I have ever read has to be The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. I read this book towards the beginning of my booktube journey, so it's been several years now, and I cry at books often. I'm a very emotional person, but when I say I cry, it usually means I get choked up, maybe one tear or something fell, not like I cried. Most books do not do that to me. But when I tell you The Nightingale made me cry, I mean The Nightingale made me sob. So this is a historical fiction, which is not my typical genre, but it takes place during World War II in France and follows 2 sisters and kind of their trajectory of what's happening with the invasion. And you've got one sister who's very rebellious and wants to like rise up against the Nazis, and then the other one is more of a rule follower, and she's like, I want to, you know, follow the rules and do what they're asking us to do so that way I can keep my family safe and kind of like fly under the radar. So we're following these sisters and they're very different personalities. And oh my gosh, it's tragic and that makes me cry, but also like it's beautifully redemptive and that also made me cry. So it kind of had the whole package there, but it so emotionally wrecked me that this was my second Kristen Hanna that I had read within like 6 months, and I haven't picked up another one of her books since because I'm just not ready to be destroyed that way again anytime soon. The last question is, what is a book you wish you could read again for the first time? Oh my word, that has to be The Silent Patient. This is like a thriller, and I don't read that many thrillers either. That's kind of a genre where when I read thrillers often, they all kind of seem to like bleed together and feel really, really similar, especially if it's like a domestic thriller. This is more of a psychological thriller, but my goodness, the ending of this book is so good and I really, really loved it. It's really funny because my husband read it before I did, and I heard him like gasp and yell from the other room, and then he came in and handed me the book and was like, I need to talk to you, you have to read this. And I wasn't feeling well that day, so I read the book in one day and then we talked about it. But it just has like such a great ending that I was just like, but like we owned it because I had gotten it from like a little free library, and I got rid of it afterwards because I'm like, I'm never gonna reread this because I already know the ending, so it's not gonna have the same impact. But man, it was such a ride. Well, there you go. There's the book recommendations tag. I talked about some books that I have read this year, some books that it has been years since I read. So it's kind of fun to like go back and think of like some older books that if you're newer to my channel, you wouldn't have heard me talk about. If you've read any of the books that I talked about, of course, I would love to hear your thoughts, but I'd also love to hear you answer some of these questions in the comments below. I'd especially love to know, like, when you're asked for a book recommendation, what are some books that you recommend? And if you're asked, what is your favorite book of all time? Do you have an answer for that? I think that's a hard one to answer, but I would love to hear some recommendations from you based on some of these questions in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.